Hi, thanks for joining us again for this short podcast. The reason why we're doing this is we had a session that we ran called Let's Talk Trauma, and this time it was on sexual abuse. We didn't record that due to the personal nature of the information people were sharing, but people wanted to have the understanding and the teaching that Manna provided throughout that. So we've decided to record this so people can still have that information there. So welcome, Manna. Thank you. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Andy.
So I guess, like I said, we did talk, and I know it was about an hour and a half during the session, but I thought we'd have a quick overview of what we did in that session so people could get a good understanding, and also for anybody else that may be suffering or may have gone through something like this as well. So I guess I'd like to ask you, first of all, is if you know, this is a very sensitive subject. Is there anything we need to sort of be aware of or understand before we get into this topic?
Yeah, so as we are just starting the conversation, we don't know where and what questions will come up or where we are leading into. So please do not take this as personal advice, because each person have their own way of dealing with situations, and what is required is to have an individualized perspective. So do not go very generic, and just look at it more from an information perspective. And if anywhere you think this resonates with you or this is how you're feeling, feel free to reach out, but just be aware of what is happening to you as you're listening to this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important to understand. One of the things that I'd like to ask you first is, you mentioned that there is a couple of different types of, you know, that sexual abuse comes in lots of different forms, but there was a couple of like contact and non-contact. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so what happens is we as a society tend to focus on only things that look dramatic or that looks very extraordinary or something out of the blue. But what we have to understand is the sexual abuse does not have to necessarily be physical. It can also be a no contact abuse where somebody witnesses it or somebody listens about that, and then they take it on, so they feel someone's experience. Or it can also be the no contact abuse, where there are instances where men or women, they do display their private parts, and then these children, they happen to see that. So that is also considered as a sexual abuse. It's just not the touch or just not the proximity. So witnessing, seeing, listening something about it is also equivalent to sexual abuse, because now understanding what we understand and how body creates the memories, you've seen it or you heard it, you created a memory, and the mind tends to act on it.
So I just want to get a bit of clarification on this. So this is when you talked about maybe a child being exposed or seeing something like that. Is this, you know, in an overly sexualized way where somebody's, you know, deliberately showing, or is it just like a child has walked past a bedroom and seen a parent just happen to be, you know, naked in there or something like that?
Yeah, so it's a thin line between experiencing the abuse itself and feeling vulnerable is there's a thin line of difference, because once somebody experiences the abuse itself, it becomes a traumatic memory for them because they're already in it, they experienced it. However, it is also very much where a child witnesses something, as you referred to, that can also be traumatic because it's a shock. And in simple words, as I define trauma is a moment frozen in memory. And that frozen moment, when you're accessing it, it creates certain sensations. So whatever the child has taken in, and that leads to forming different opinions and different ways of looking at relationships when they grow up. So that is also a form of abuse.
Understood. So with that in mind then, and you also mentioned about somebody just hearing about something. So how can that form? If we're talking like a second person being shared with a second person, and how would that create
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you look at human experience, we are experience seekers by default. So we want to experience it. Whether you watch movies, you watch news, or you read a book, it is very natural that in that moment, that is your reality. As you're watching it, reading it, listening, even the books that you are, the audibles. So just because you are listening and not experiencing it does not make it anything less sensory experience. So
Mm.
even listening it, because the reason is we constantly connect to every information, every data that is coming into our field. So when you're listening about it, and imagine, for example, this person, whether be it a child or a grown up, say, imagine if they have certain aversion or certain dislikes. And then at that point of time, if they're listening to something, that can create a traumatic effect because of the sensory experiences. So, me as a child, I used to really not be very comfortable with seeing crawling insects. And when I'm having food, somebody says anything mentioning about a crawling insect or draw parallels to a crawling insect, it is already in my sensory field. So I connect to that information and you will dislike it. So it's the same way you extend to this too. So it's all, and also these are for most of my clients that I see, these are taboo topics. It's a taboo to even mention those things or talk about those things while it is a very biological need for many. So, because of that, something that is not supposed to be done, and if they are listening, then it's all you're already creating an extra layer of sensitivity to it.
Mm.
And
Awesome.
then when that happens to be unpleasant, it will remain as a frozen moment.
Mm. So I realize that probably most people here may be thinking that listening to this or watching this will feel that that sexual abuse is something that's happened to you, but what you're kind of saying is that there's lots of different layers to this,
Yeah,
and you can take it on board in lots of different ways,
yeah.
which is important to understand. So one of the things that you talked about, which I found really fascinating on Wednesday, was that you talked about there's 5 different areas. I think there was five different areas when it comes to how people experience sexual abuse and how it affects them later on in life. So I just wondered if we could go through them one at a time and just explain a little bit about how that works. Is that okay?
Sure. All right. So we did talk about these 5 areas, which are affairs, addictions, phobias, gender dislikes or gender issues, and self-worth issues. So these are the 5 areas that are usually affected for an individual. So when we talk about affairs, you can take the whole gambit of relationships, because if somebody experiences sexual abuse, and again, don't get me wrong, the intensity of somebody experiencing it is completely a different experience and a different memory altogether that we have to work with as a traumatic memory. And that can be complex also, because not only because the person experienced it, but because it's also the surroundings, what happens before and after, that creates that layers of memories to a person who experienced it, like group molestation or any of those experiences. But however, in the name of such complexity, we usually see that they brush away these so-called minor sexual abusive events of displaying or witnessing or listening, but they both have equal impact on a person's psyche, and they form different opinions, respect and disrespecting. So they create so many meanings through that sensory experiences. So what happens is, as a result, if somebody creates or somebody experiences something and you do not know what meaning they made out of it, and that can come in the form of affairs, can also be a reason. Affairs can also go back to this root cause of sexual abuse in some instances, at least from my experience, what I have seen, because there is a meaning that has been created where there is mostly it can be a people-pleasing thing, or it can be fear of missing out, or it can be experience that not to be missed, or or it can be also a meaning where I've been taken advantage, so I don't care for anybody. So you do not understand the depth to which an individual's mind can make a meaning. It's nothing about the individual himself or herself. So as a result, the affairs will have root in all these experiences of the past. That is one area where, and also that extends to workplaces, that extends to how you perceive a man and a woman's relationship. Is it purely physical? Is it a game of control? Is it the way that you receive respect? And that can be emotionally abusive too. So when you find yourself or your colleagues or someone you know are displaying these tendencies of control through physical intimacy, or control through relationships, or control through affinity towards different people, you should, I think now the word I would use is be more compassionate than judgmental, because you don't know if there is a root of sexual abuse behind the behavior. Then the second aspect is addictions. Addictions is a greatest form of distraction, because as I mentioned about one of my clients, so the addiction is not necessarily to do something over and over. It's also, the addiction is also something not to do over and over, is also an addiction. And we think addiction is to drugs, or addiction is to alcohol or substance abuse, but addiction can be to a thought of, say, for example, I don't want to go and mingle with people. Not wanting to mingle with people can also be an addiction. Not wanting to talk to certain type of people is also an addiction, because your mind is stubborn not to do something. So to do something repetitively or not to do something again and again is the same thread of experience. So they both are in the form addictions. However, we as a society recognize addictions only if it is detrimental to another person or to the society. But we fail to recognize these addictions if they are detrimental to the individual himself or herself, and we call them mental health issues, but in fact it is not, because there is an addiction and rehabilitation is required in that space too. So why addictions? Because if I look at my client population and I see their backgrounds, some form or the other, we do have some kind of faith-based childhood conditionings, or society-based childhood conditionings as to how you should be and you should not be, or how you view intimacy and relationships, and how. So one of my clients who felt that in her family, it's by pleasing the men, she can get whatever she can, and she gave in. But it's at the same time, it's also violating her own character, violating her own values. So addiction is a form of avoiding themselves. So it's not necessarily avoiding people, it's the form of avoiding their own fears. It's the form of avoiding their own guilt or shame, because guilt and shame plays a major role in sexual abuse. And but that manifests as anger, frustration, or being aloof or withdrawing, or the tendency to be an extrovert, to say I'm okay and I'm still lovable. So they're proving to themselves I'm wanted by being that an extrovert, or they're proving themselves that I don't care for the world by being an introvert. So these are all different forms of addictions that have manifest in someone's life. The third one I was referring to is about phobias. So phobias are where someone experience, because again this awareness has got everything in it. So when somebody is being abused, and the colors, the fragrances, the things that they see around, it can be a plant in the room when they're being abused. So they do not know why they dislike this plant, but most likely there is a connection with that abuse, or at that point of time with the experience itself. So there will be certain level of phobias which are very completely irrational. You don't think you can be afraid of such things. It can be an alarm clock, it can be a siren, it can be an ambulance, it can be a plant, or it can be a pen, or a specific colored pen. So these are all can be phobias, and then there is absolutely no reason logically for you to think they are not harmful, but it is connected to the experience itself. So if you are experiencing any such phobias and you're not reasoning, not able to find out why, just check those memories. And if anything is coming up, see if you can get some help to release those memories. Is the third phobias. Then the fourth is the gender issues and likes and dislikes. So I'm not here by any chance generalizing anything, but from my experience working with clients, I realized that it is the sexual abuse that will also help them. Sexual abuse or witnessing their mom and dad having fights, or they're having some issues, or they being abused, or witnessing an abuse will lead this individual to take a decision. For example, I don't want to be like my father, or I don't want to be like my mother. And they will generalize that mother and a father to the gender, and they will create this certain like and dislike towards specific gender. And some people create dislike towards the way a specific gender looks or a specific person looks, and they dislike them for no known reasons. So that is also a possibility. So whenever you or your child is changing those behaviors or shifting their likes and dislikes and preferences, it is important to watch out if there is any such incidents or friends talking about something, and then they can take a decision, you know what, I will never be like that boy or that girl or that man. And then they will naturally embody the change in their way of dressing or in the way of looking at things. Or that's the reason why I say, please, parents, don't become friends to your children, that you share everything with them. And please don't allow your children to become your parents and your listeners, because they form decisions and they take meaning. So if you're telling about how their dad or their mom is abusive, they are making decisions not to be like that, not to be that itself. So please don't do that unless and until you know they are mature enough to have their own opinions and decisions. So this emotional game between the parents itself will affect the child, and then they make their own decisions. And one of my clients who had an experience in her college decided that she will never want to be with a man. So, and then this is not a direct result of a direct conversation, but they are quite deeper identity conflicts that this abuse can create, and they can take those decisions. And then when we're working further with this person, it goes back to her childhood as to how she decided that and how much she disliked men because they don't take care for women. So it's important to rule out these traumas and phobias and fears and addictions before we accept something as the norm. So I think that's one. And the fifth area is usually the self-worth, because in that moment when they personally experience something, they made a definition or they felt they are so unlovable that somebody could think of doing it. Because for that person, that mind, because want to belong is a natural state of a human mind. Want to be connected and trusting is also a very natural state of human mind. So as much as we hear as practitioners that people say trust is important to me, but that is stemming from being hurt because of the same thing called trust. That's the reason why they cling to the word called trust. But by default, we as humans naturally trust. We want to connect, we want to belong. But when they experienced a threat to that, that's the reason when they cling to this need to belong or need to connect. So it is an unnatural state when they are clinging to it, that I want to belong, I want to connect, because you don't think I want air or I want to breathe. You don't say that because that's your natural state. But if somebody is using that in their language, you should understand that somewhere down the line that has been disrupted for them, and that affects their self-worth. So that is the fifth area. So if you are experiencing in any of these 5 areas, if you have manifested any of these in your life, and not necessarily you have to go to the extremes of affairs, even as simple as if you can be mindful about if that's your way of controlling in relationships or in workplaces. If you can observe yourself, and then if you can be a little more mindful and self-aware, you will be able to go back and resolve that trauma as a result of sexual abuse.
Yes, thank you. That was a very extensive explanation, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. What I'd like to just sort of talk about is one of the things you mentioned was about, we create identities from an event that happens and how that can sort of take over our natural identity. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that for me, please.
I think you have to repeat that one more time, Andrew, so I can connect the dots.
So when you talk about, when we go through an event, and it doesn't have to be sexual abuse, but this is that we create an identity conflict, and so we create a different identity that's around that. And I wondered if you just could explain that a little to us. Did that make more sense?
Yeah, all right. Thank you. So let's take the concept of trust and let us build the identity conflict around that. So imagine this child whose natural tendency is to trust. Now, when somebody greets them, they would respond back to them. If somebody offers something to them, they would naturally receive it because we are wired as humans to trust each other unless we are disproved of the fact. So when your natural identity is to trust, and then when you experience something like this, like someone you knew or someone you trusted, it can be a father, because surprisingly, it is alarming that most of the times the abuse happens from a member within the family or someone whom you know in the network or the family friend. So it's very surprisingly alarming, but it's also very common now to hear that happening. So at that point of time, it's an uncle or an aunt that this child trusted, or a grandmother whom they trusted, or a mother whom they trusted. But because of their own mental health issues, when they misbehave with this child, for example, or because of their own insecurities, they abuse this child in this instance, then that child's trust is disrupted. That natural identity of trust is disrupted. So as much as they want to be normal, but can you imagine now what are all the aspects that a child has to consider from now on, that something unusual that they know but they do not know at the same time has happened. Then they have to make sense out of it, and then they have to understand how to live with it. And if they are not getting a chance to express it, then they also have to learn to be normal while they cannot be. So they're already forced to pretend and to say yes or to say no against their will, because sometimes it can be, if it's the family itself, their emotions will come to play. And then if you're a little more grown up, then your securities will come to play. And then you will decide not to say anything about it or not to talk anything about it out of fear, but the trust has already been disrupted. And this child, as a result, they created layers and layers of identities of how to cope with something that has happened, but they cannot express. So throughout their life, already there is one identity of who naturally, genuinely trusts everybody. And there is this beautiful naivety and innocence about this individual. And also the other part is where they're constantly trying to protect themselves. And in the form of that protection, they tend to doubt every individual that comes in touch with them. And this will extend into relationships too. So now this person who naturally used to trust people has now been trained by their mind and by their body to protect themselves and to question everybody and their intentions. And now when they get into partnerships or relationships, how can they ever view this touch or the intimacy as they're used to, as the child who could trust? Can you see the conflict that it just created in that? So we think it's a relationship issue or they have intimacy issues, because most often what happens is the first thing that gets affected in relationship is intimacy, and as a result everything else. But can you now see how that identity, who they're still there in the child who can trust, at the same time they do not trust, because they're worried if you allow someone close into your circle, they might hurt you. But the partner who comes into your life at a later stage will not even know about what happened in the past. So how are they even equipped to understand, apart from reading the signs that you're displaying today and judging you based on that, because that is their own journey too. So can you see how in a simple trust that is so essential, that's the identity conflict. So does that mean this person is not trustworthy because they're doubting everything? And sometimes they can go to the extremes of sarcasm. They can go to the extremes of criticism because it becomes a threat to their known world. Right. So, and then the absolutely complex cases can be when they're repeatedly abused, where they think this is the norm. Then for them to live with this new identity once they release the trauma is also such a big, huge gap, because the conflict is, oh, all right, so I was thinking this is the norm, but that's not. Can you imagine the world that has been shattered, which they believed is right? And now how to live in this new world with this new conflict. So that's where I often say releasing trauma is one aspect, and living with this newfound identity is the next phase. And you need hand-holding there too. So it's just not healing, but it is also rehabilitating. So you need that hand-holding.
Yes, thank you. I just want to put almost like a bow on what you're saying there. But one of the things that strikes me is we talked about relationships, and obviously there's going to be an effect in a relationship. I think most people would say that they can see a direct correlation between that. But does this not trusting or area of conflict that they've created in their identity, would that spread out to every area of their life? Because I can see that if you're not trusting, it might not be a partner, but could it be in workplaces? Could it be in just, in everyday life, in everyday situations, you naturally have that, that conflict? Is that pattern playing out?
Yeah, very, very much so. Because, the work-life balance, the more, if you see somebody who is more clinging to this work-life balance, you can understand that they are pretending so much away from their natural states at work. And if you understand why they have to pretend so much at work, that they can feel that they're not there in their natural states, is because they're already conditioned to behave something different that they are not. Right? So it's the very simplest way to understand that is, if somebody is really craving for work-life balance, just ask, what are you pretending so much? And this will also extend into careers in such a way that this is very normal again, and this is quite a sensitive space that I am sharing it here. Both men and women, natural, and if you look at some research also, that it will show you the research and statistics there, which I don't have right now on my hand, but I would like to. So it shows that both men and women use their sexuality for their growth. It is a very common thing to do that. It's a very natural state to do that. So, but when they're abused in the past, and when they already developed a disrespect or a dislike towards a specific gender, they will manifest the same in their workplaces. So as much as a person will manifest a narcissistic partner in their life, because as much as they don't like the narcissism, they still somehow conditioned to believe that narcissism is a good form of control over them, so they don't make mistakes in spite of the abuse. So that's the same way you manifest in your workplaces also, where you will be saying, I have a narcissistic boss or a colleague or an employee with whom I don't get along well, but most likely they are your biases. You are biased because of the abuse of the past. So if you can overcome that, then you will naturally see a much more genuine world around you, a supportive world around you. So quite often, it is important to look into yourself when you think the external circumstances or external situations are not helping you. That is from a career perspective. All right. And then it also extends into your health, because the inability to say no manifests in your body as a disease too. Because you're afraid to say no, or you're afraid to express something. So anything suppressed has to come out of your body in some form. It has to come out. It's as simple as you eat oily food and you get some spots and pimples on your body. Anything that is accumulating has to come out of your body in some form. So whether your skin issues or I do have clients who had created diseases in their reproductive organs or in their bodies because they believed that they cannot express or they cannot talk about it, but they stored that memory in that part of the body. So you also create diseases as a result, and in many forms, in not only directly suppression, not only just inability to say no, but it is also shame that can be manifested as, because where you experience shame and you don't know any other way to get validation, you may choose to create a disease in your body. So you think, I can overcome shame with sickness and get that attention or validation. So it will affect your health. So not just relationships, career, business, health. So these are all the areas too that gets affected. So what is important is if you're experiencing, just look around your environment, look around people. And if you think somebody is telling you, somebody is not considering you, or somebody is not supporting you, perhaps it is your judgment. And the judgment is not wrong because your judgment is stemming from your past experience. So the key is you have to heal that wound. And then you will naturally create a new world.
Yeah, so I think for people who haven't heard you speak before, and maybe there'll be people who listen to this who haven't, I think there may be a bit of confusion for some people with an understanding when you say that we store all these emotions in our body. So I wonder if you could just sort of briefly explain what you mean by that and how that manifests in your body.
All right. So even before you make a meaning of an experience in using your mind, intellect, and your logic, your body is a very powerful equipment that you carry with you. And this body is so sensitive that if that body can create a disease and that body can heal itself, if you don't interact with your mind, that body is that powerful. Because of that sensitivity, it's so interesting that your eye can be your first filter of information, or your ears can be the first filters of information. And as they see, because we always create both the internal worlds and the external worlds. So we see something outside and we create the same vision or a different picture or a different sound. We create an internal world with its own individual characteristics. So that is a memory on its own. And that memory sometimes may not even touch your mind or the meaning or logic. It has absolute no connection. But people focus a lot on the meaning or the mind and how we are experiencing it or how we are feeling it or how we are logically analyzing it. You may be so overpowered by that, but the body, which has experienced it through your five senses, even before communicating that information to the mind to process and make a meaning, has already created a memory. So it is very much, I call it a biomemory, and it is in your body. And it is interesting to see that 100%, I experience this with every client, that these memories are stored in your body, and everybody stores in a different body part. So, and also it's interesting to know, because we tend to generalize that heart is for sadness or stomach is for fear. But it is very interesting to note that every individual has got their own constitution and definition of emotions, and they associate with their body parts absolutely different. And it is stored in the body. So that's the reason why I work first on the memories, even before working on emotions or the patterns or the meanings. So it is an interesting space to observe yourself.
Thank you. I guess taking this back then to abuse, I mean, I know that there'll be people who have suffered, and I know you deal with a lot of people who've suffered for 10, 20, 30 years and not been able to get rid of them traumatic memories and emotions. So if that's the case with people, is there hope? Because, you know, a lot of people just feel that they've got, it's something that they have to now deal with, they have to now live with. and they have to just sort of either put it aside and get on with life. Is there a hope of real resolution for that and real recovery from an event like that?
Sure. So I don't really want to talk about different modalities or mainstream therapies here, but if we can really start looking at the body, mind, and energy as a unit, and if we can start unpacking before putting them together and calling it me, if we can start learning the simple process of looking at body, mind, and energy as three different entities, and if we can start learning about how they function and how they behave, it will help every individual to heal themselves. But because of this lack of awareness, they are suffering for more than 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, or 50 years, because we have to understand how this mind and this individual is adding layers through the experiences, which I call it the ego hamster wheel. If you do not understand that, and if you do not see this trauma or traumatic experiences from a lens of ego and a lens of being, unless you start viewing it that way, it is hard to release them just by processing logically, just by processing with meanings. It's not possible, because there's something deeper than that. Because that's what I see happening, is you can go give a lot of instructions to your subconscious mind to release it, but your memory is deeper than subconscious. And you can give a lot of affirmations, and that's what I see happening, a lot of affirmations, a lot of subconscious talk, and then it goes back to the point where it will still hold on to that memory, which is not really anything connected to mind, but it is the body and energy. So there is hope, and it is really not irreversible. It is really not a prison. And I do hear people when I say it is possible that you do not have to be in the prison because of the pain they have suffered. They almost resigned to the fact that they have to live with it. But I can assure you that it is possible to reverse it and to regain your life. Very much possible.
Thank you. And I know that clients that you work with, you don't do a lot of sessions with them. So I know often it can be 3 sessions, sometimes 6 sessions, and that's a complete breakthrough for them. So what are you doing that's different to other people out there that say that tell us that healing's a journey, and they can be going and seeing people for months and years even with traditional therapies?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, Andy, and I don't know if I can explain what is different, but what this much I can tell you is it's almost like you have this stubborn mark on the floor, dirt on the floor, that you're not able to move it. And what I do different is I help you by accessing the memories, body, and energy to remove the stubborn mark. And there may be a stain, but that stain will fade away with little bit of I say continuous self-inquiry and consistent conscious choices. But it's the stubborn mark that I can help you to get rid of and to work with it. But that is only possible by understanding yourself. And so again, you opened up a different conversation completely, and I would love to briefly address it. Most of the times the trauma we carry is in the definition of it. It's as simple as that. So sometimes it is not the trauma itself, but it's your definition of the trauma that you create and recreate in your body and mind. And I think if I had to dive into that space, what I think I do different is, instead of getting carried away by the word trauma, you have to look behind and see, is it really trauma? So Quite often, I tell my clients that that's not trauma because, as you know, I talk about the time paradox of past, present, and future. So, as much as the past is over, quite often it is the mind that wants to cling to the past and reiterate the fact that I have been victimized. It's almost like a lack of responsibility or not wanting to take it. But again, none of this conversation is conscious because none of us consciously want to be responsible, because we as a human race want to contribute, want to be responsible, want to do something about it. We want good for people as a human race. That's a conscious effort. But whatever I'm talking here is very subconscious that you cannot connect because these are the deeper threads that are formed in these emotion and meaning and logic. So if there is anything, if I can consider that this is different, I think it's in the definition of trauma itself. And that's where I make a difference, I believe, because you have to view at it very differently.
Yes, thank you. Is there anything that if somebody's watching this or listening that they can do, or they can, without seeing, or if we know that there's horrendous waiting times for people to see therapists and things like that. And obviously, if they're suffering from frequent traumatic emotions or triggers or memories, is there anything they can do that can bring them out, or at least stop them going into that rabbit hole, or bring them out quicker, or recognize it before they get into that you could share, that could alleviate some of these before they can find themselves getting help?
I think it is about creating the gap between the experience, the emotion, and the reaction. It is about creating the gap. But not everybody is equipped to create the gap with choice between the emotion and the reaction. So they quickly fall into it. And when especially somebody who experienced abuse or a traumatic event in the past, it is only natural that there is no gap. They straight away fall into the emotion. However, what you can do as a starting point is when you identify that feeling, or when you catch yourself feeling a negative way, or when you think you're rushing, or you're feeling anxious, or you're feeling depressed, when you identify that, stop. Stop, bring awareness to your body, and take a deep breath into that body part, because your body speaks to you. Amazingly, it speaks to you. Just observe, where are you experiencing these sensations as a result of this emotion, and breathe it out. Do it 3 times. And as a start, if you can just do that every 2 hours a day, just stop, observe how you're feeling in your body. And if there is any discomfort or any sensation or any triggers, your body speaks to you. When you feel that, take a deep breath in into that body part and breathe out 3 times. If you can start doing that, then you will at least start the process of creating that gap, that observation of that emotion coming up, because emotion is nothing but the memory of an experience. And when your body is bringing up, whenever it sees something or senses something, if you can create that gap, you will be able to at least hold on for that day or for that moment, but make it a regular practice and seek help.
Yeah. And I guess the idea is there that just like anybody doing any exercise, you'd be creating a small gap at first, but then hopefully as you do this, you create bigger gaps between between the thoughts and falling into that emotion of that. I guess that's that. And that's why you talk about the consistent conscious choices, helps you create that. But look, again, I think that's some fantastic information there. And of course, I know what you're all about is giving people a result and giving people that hope that, like you said, it doesn't have to be a prison. So is there anything you'd like to say just before we finish talking today?
No, I think I said everything I had to share with you about the abuse and the traumatic events. So if there is anything, please do know that you do not have to stay in this prison, and you're not so broken that you cannot be fixed. It is very much possible, and there is hope. That's if I can give that to you today, my purpose is served.
Awesome. Thank you so much.